The most dangerous person you will ever meet is not someone filled with rage or malice. It is someone who hollowed themselves out so completely, so quietly, that they genuinely cannot tell the difference between performing a feeling and having one. Jung was not primarily interested in behavior. That distinction matters enormously. He was interested in what was happening beneath behavior. To him, what a person did in the world was only the surface signal. The real information lived in the structure underneath. And the structure he described starts with two concepts that most people have heard of, but very few people truly understand. The first is the persona. The word comes from the Latin term for a theatrical mask, and Jung used it deliberately. The persona is the version of you that you present to the world. It is shaped by social expectations, by survival instincts, by the feedback you have received over the years about which versions of yourself are acceptable and which ones are not. Everyone has a persona. That is not dysfunction. That is humanity. You show up differently at a job interview than you do on the couch at home on a Sunday. The persona allows us to move through different contexts without constant friction. It is a tool. The second concept is the shadow. And this is where things get genuinely interesting. The shadow, according to Jung, is everything the persona excludes. Every emotion you judged as too messy, every need you decided was too embarrassing to admit, every fear, every insecurity, every fragment of yourself that you looked at and decided did not belong in the version you were presenting to the world. Jung was very clear that the shadow is not inherently evil. It is simply what is left over. It is the parts of you that were put in a drawer because they did not fit the outfit you were wearing. The problem is not that the shadow exists. The problem is what happens when you pretend it does not. In a healthy psychological life, there is a conversation between the persona and the shadow. You wear the mask when the situation calls for it, and you take it off when you are alone. You look at what is in the drawer, you acknowledge it, maybe you work through it, maybe you integrate some of it into how you understand yourself. Jung called this process individuation. It is the lifelong project of becoming a whole person rather than a curated one. It requires honesty that is not comfortable. It requires you to sit with the parts of yourself that are genuinely hard to look at without flinching or running. But it is the only path that leads somewhere real. Now here is where the narcissistic pattern begins to take shape. And here is where Jung's thinking gets genuinely difficult to dismiss. The narcissist does not make a conscious decision at some identifiable point to reject the shadow and double down on the persona. It does not work that way. What happens is subtler and honestly more heartbreaking. What happens is a survival adaptation. Very early, often in childhood, the environment communicates something to the developing person. The message is not always loud or explicit. Sometimes it is delivered through absence, sometimes through conditional approval, sometimes through an environment where being vulnerable meant being punished, mocked, dismissed, or ignored. And the developing psyche, which is remarkably adaptive, responds to that environment logically. It learns that the real self, the one that is uncertain and needy and genuinely human, is not safe to show. So it buries it, and it builds something impressive in its place. The mask goes up. And here's the crucial part. The mask works. It gets results. It generates approval and admiration and the feeling of safety that comes from being perceived as invulnerable. So the mask gets stronger. The investment in the image grows deeper. Year after year, the persona becomes more elaborate, more defended, more consuming, and the self underneath it gets less and less air. The longer this goes on, the more something genuinely strange begins to happen. The person stops experiencing the mask as a mask. They begin to experience it as reality. The performance stops being a performance and starts being the whole story. The distinction between who they are and who they are pretending to be collapses. And the shadow, all that buried material, those locked away emotions, those denied vulnerabilities, they do not vanish. They cannot. Jung was emphatic about this. What you bury in the psyche does not decompose. It waits. And while it waits, it grows in pressure. He used the image of a pressure cooker, and it is exactly right. The persona is the lid. The heat underneath is the accumulated weight of everything that was never allowed to surface. A healthy person finds regular ways to let the steam out. The narcissist sits on the lid harder. Every year, more pressure, more heat, more weight, and a lid that has not moved in 2 decades. Now the piece that trips most people up. Most people assume the narcissist knows exactly what they are doing. They imagine a cold, calculating person running a deliberate program of manipulation and control, aware of every move and enjoying the power. And while there are surface moments that can look that way, Jung pushed through that surface into something far more disturbing. The most unsettling finding was not that narcissists choose to cause harm. It was that they genuinely cannot fully access the internal machinery that would register harm as harm in the first place. This brings us to one of the most important distinctions you will encounter in understanding this pattern. There is a difference between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is the intellectual ability to recognize that another person is in pain, to read the signals, identify the emotion, understand what is happening from the outside. Many narcissists have this capacity. They can be remarkably perceptive. They can read a room with precision. What they lack is effective empathy, which is the felt experience of that recognition. The ability to not just know that you are hurting, but to actually feel something in response to your pain. They can identify your emotion the way a translator might identify a word in a foreign language, without having any felt connection to what that word means from the inside. That gap between knowing and feeling, between processing and experiencing, is exactly what Jung was pointing at when he described the narcissist's interior world as hollowed out at its core. And he framed this not as moral failing, but as psychological consequence. The natural result of decades of investment in the persona at the total expense of the inner life. Consider the kind of case profile that Jung would have worked with. An individual who projects confidence so completely that rooms orient around them, whose social image is immaculate, whose accomplishments are real and acknowledged, who seems by every external measure to be thriving. But watch what happens when closeness becomes possible. When a relationship deepens to the point where real vulnerability would be required. The distancing starts, the sudden loss of interest, the subtle reframing of the other person as somehow inadequate or beneath them. The relationship is not ended in a moment of dramatic honesty. It simply gets managed out, quietly and efficiently, and the narcissist experiences this not as fear of intimacy but as discernment, as evidence of high standards. That reframing is the persona at work. The same defense that once protected a frightened child from an unsafe environment is now operating as automatic programming in a grown adult. Every impulse toward genuine closeness gets intercepted, relabeled, and redirected away from vulnerability before it can breach the wall of the image. And the person living inside all of this genuinely experiences their coldness as composure, their control as leadership, their unwillingness to be known as strength. But here is what happens over time. Jung documented this carefully across multiple case histories. As the narcissist moves through life, and as the years accumulate, something begins to surface at the edges. Not loudly, not in a way that immediately makes sense to them. It shows up in quieter moments. Watching someone cry at something beautiful and feeling nothing but a kind of detached puzzlement. Hearing someone speak about being truly known by another person and feeling not quite envy, something more like confusion, like being told about a place everyone else seems to have been and having no memory of ever going there. These are the first signals of what Jung described as the encounter with inner emptiness. He called it psychic death, a state arrived at when a person has lived so completely on the surface that the interior has not been inhabited in so long that it no longer feels like a home. For the purposes of being completely honest about what this experience actually involves, call it the void, because that is precisely what it is. Not a dramatic breakdown, not visible suffering, just an empty room at the center of a very impressive house. Just a silence where the richness of a genuine inner life should be. And here is the image that Jung returned to when he tried to articulate this. Think of the interior self as a room. Throughout a life genuinely lived, things accumulate in that room. Honest relationships that required something real from you. Moments of grief that you actually moved through rather than managed. Experiences of connection that could not be instrumentalized. Even failures, even pain. even the times you were wrong and had to admit it. All of those things add something to the room. They give it texture, weight, depth. They make a person feel substantial and genuinely present in their own life. The narcissist's chest, by fortifying the persona decade after decade, has been removing things from that room the whole time. Every genuine emotion suppressed, removed. Every real relationship replaced with a transactional one, removed. Every opportunity for honest self-examination avoided, removed, until the room is empty, and the person is standing alone inside it, surrounded by the most polished exterior imaginable, with no idea how to bring anything real back in, because every skill they developed across their entire lifetime was oriented toward taking things out. And then the pressure cooker cracks. Jung documented this too, and it is the part that tends to blindside everyone around the narcissist. Because the person who was never rattled, who was always composed, who always managed to reframe everything back to their advantage, suddenly becomes completely unrecognizable. And the trigger is almost always disproportionately small. A minor slight, a moment of perceived public embarrassment, something that the average person would process and release in an afternoon. But the reaction is not about the trigger. It never is. The trigger was just the crack in the lid. What comes through the crack is 20 years of accumulated pressure. Every denied vulnerability, every suppressed shame, every buried fear. The shadow does not leak out, it erupts. And what comes out in that eruption is not a personality change. Jung was clear about this. It is a personality reveal. It is the first honest glimpse of what was actually living underneath the persona the whole time. Modern psychology gives this a name: narcissistic injury and narcissistic rage. The vocabulary is different from what Jung was working with. The mechanism he identified is identical. When the perceived threat to the image reaches a threshold that the persona cannot manage, the buried material finds its fracture point and comes through it. And then, if the person survives the eruption, if the relationships do not all collapse immediately, if enough of the external structure holds together, the lid gets reinforced again. The persona reasserts itself. The image gets explained and rebuilt, and the cycle continues, but with a little more pressure underneath and a little less certainty that the lid will hold forever. Here is where Jung issued his most honest and difficult caution. He was genuinely skeptical about the possibility of change in the most entrenched cases. He described the prerequisite for the individuation journey as what he called the moral hook, a small thread of self-awareness, a fragment of the original self that has not been completely buried, something to hold while you begin the work. Without that thread, there is nothing to pull on, and the ego structure in severe cases is so fused with the mask that dismantling the mask does not register as growth or liberation. It registers as total destruction of the self. Because for someone who has lived entirely in the persona for 40 years, there is no other self they can identify. Asking them to take the mask off is not asking them to be more authentic. It is asking them to cease to exist. And the psyche will resist that with everything it has. This does not mean change is categorically impossible for everyone on this spectrum. It means that the return journey is exceptionally rare and cannot be produced by external pressure, by love, by patience, by consistency, by the perfect combination of distance and warmth. It can only be initiated from within, and only if that thread still exists, and only if the person is willing to follow it into the discomfort of what they actually find. Jung was honest that in the most severe cases, the void simply deepens. The performance continues. The image holds until something breaks it irreparably, and then the silence that was always at the center of it becomes impossible to avoid. Now here is where this becomes directly relevant to you, because if you are watching this, you are here for a reason. You have likely spent time trying to understand someone in your life for whom this pattern resonates. A parent who was present in the room but completely absent from the relationship. A partner whose affection felt real enough to stay for but hollow enough to leave you perpetually confused. A person you loved who somehow made you feel invisible in the middle of a conversation about your own pain. You may have spent years asking yourself what you did wrong, reviewing every interaction, searching for the thing you said or did not say, the need you expressed or failed to express, the way you were too much or not enough. Jung's framework gives you something concrete to replace all of that searching with. What you encountered was not a verdict on your value. It was the outer edge of someone else's interior collapse. The wall you were trying to break through was not built to keep you specifically out. It was built decades before you arrived to keep a frightened self in. You were not the reason for the coldness. You were simply the most recent person to encounter it. Understanding this does not require you to forgive everything. It does not require you to minimize what happened or stay in a situation that cost you. It does not require you to extend unlimited compassion to someone who may never do the work required to cross back from the persona to the self. Jung was clear that individuation is a solo journey. You cannot complete it for another person. You cannot love someone into self-awareness. You can only make the door visible, and even that is rarely enough if they have forgotten what is behind it. What this understanding gives you is something more practically powerful than sympathy. It gives you the ability to stop making what happened about you, to stop interpreting someone else's inability to connect as evidence that you were somehow insufficient. The connection was never available, not specifically with you, not with anyone. The capacity for it had been sealed off long before you walked into the room. And it gives you a model for your own inner work, because every single one of us has a persona. Every single one of us has a shadow. We are all navigating the same tension between the version of ourselves we want to project in the full, complicated, imperfect truth of who we actually are. The question is where we put our energy, whether we invest in polishing the image or in genuinely knowing ourselves, whether we take the mask off at the end of the day and sit honestly with what we find underneath, or whether we wear it around the clock until we forget what our own face looks like without it. The inner work is not something you schedule for when everything else has settled down. It is not a reward you get when the rest of life is handled. It is the actual work. It is the thing beneath everything else. Because the alternative, the life built entirely around the persona, does not lead somewhere impressive. It leads to the void, the polished empty room, the silent house that looks extraordinary from the street and has nothing living inside it. Jung did not look away from this. He documented it case by case, pattern by pattern, with a precision that was both clinical and, in its own quiet way, compassionate. He never described narcissists as enemies. He described them as people who had made a series of understandable, unconscious choices over a long period of time and who were living with the full accumulated weight of those choices, whether they could feel that weight or not. The brutal truth is not that the narcissist is terrible. The brutal truth is that they are already paying a price for the life they constructed. Every interaction that never quite reaches genuine warmth. Every relationship that never goes below the surface. Every moment of external triumph that lands without satisfaction because there is no one home inside to receive it. The cost is being paid in the only currency that actually matters, which is genuine human experience. Paid one missed connection at a time, one sealed off moment at a time, one defended interaction at a time. You cannot rescue someone from a prison they have built so carefully that they experience it as freedom. Jung knew this. He documented it honestly, and he did not pretend otherwise. But you can refuse to construct one of your own. You can choose every single day to do the uncomfortable work of lifting the lid, acknowledging the shadow, and investing in the interior life that makes everything else actually mean something. That choice is not always easy. The mask is comfortable. The persona keeps things smooth. The shadow is not easy to look at. But the room at the center of your life, the one that is yours alone, that room is worth filling with real things, worth protecting from the slow emptying that happens when performance replaces presence, year after year, one small unconscious adaptation at a time. The narcissist's tragedy is that they never made that choice, or made it too late, or in the most severe cases, could not recognize it as a choice at all. Your opportunity is that you are still here, still asking questions, still willing to look, and that is not a small thing. That is the thread, The one Jung said everything depends on. Hold on to it, follow it, see what it leads you to. Because the destination, the genuine, integrated, fully inhabited self is worth every uncomfortable step of the journey that gets you there.